Hi everyone, nice to see you guys all in here. So here's the second video on the debate between Putnam and von Frassen concerning the observational theoretical distinction. So recall Putnam claims that the observational theoretical distinction is untenable. It's untenable because anything that we claim is directly observable, we start to notice that this directly observable thing has features that are not directly observable. So I'm directly observable, but the atoms that make me up are not. And it doesn't make sense, according to Putnam, to claim that I exist, but the non-directly observable atoms that make me up do not exist. Okay? By the same token, it doesn't make much sense to say that the color green exists when I perceive the green grass, but that nevertheless the surface reflectance distribution that is responsible for generating my color perception of green does not exist. Again, it doesn't make sense. Now, the observational theoretical distinction, its importance, at least according to Putnam, is that it's supposed to help us divide up the universe between things that are in principle observable versus things that can never be observed, even in principle. So the observational theoretical distinction is supposed to kind of help us divide up really science versus pseudoscience. So like the things that are in principle observable according to Putnam is like me, you know, tables, dogs, but also even atoms, electrons, you know, cells, etc. So even though we can't directly perceive these things with the naked human eye, in principle they're observable because we can perceive them in some way using technology, right? Using a microscope or something. Now, things that can never be observed, even in principle, for Putnam would be things like, you know, ghosts. So things that are non-physical, angels, you know, souls, etc. So the distinction, according to Putnam and most philosophers, is to help us divide up really like science versus pseudoscience, things that concern physical reality, like the physical entities of reality, versus things that are non-physical. Now, for von Frassen, the distinction is a little so, but as we saw though, Putnam starts with this, but he says the distinction itself actually doesn't help us get to sorting out things in this way that we want, and therefore the distinction doesn't really make sense, and we should just let go of it. And you know, there's reasons we believe in the existence of these things, and we don't believe in the existence of these things, right? Because these are physical and these are not. Okay, now for von Frassen, the distinction is a little bit more specific. So for the things that are observable, they're going to be not things that can be in principle observed, but things that can only be directly observed with the naked human eye. Whereas for von Frassen, therefore, the non-observable, so the theoretical, would just be the opposite. Things that cannot be directly observed with the naked eye. And the use of the word naked eye. So things that we do observe with things that we observe that require something over and above the naked eye would be things like we see under a microscope, or things that we see, in through these measuring systems. And now, according to von Frassen, these things that require some kind of measuring system or some kind of, microscope or some technology that helps us perceive that thing, we cannot say that we for sure know that those things exist. So, according to von Frassen, we can't say that we know for sure that atoms exist, or that atoms exist in the way that we perceive them via Brownian motion or whatever. Why? Because when we observe atoms, whether through Brownian motion or whether through super high-powered kind of microscopes, we're not directly perceiving an atom in the same way you're directly perceiving me in this video and your computer and a table and a chair. No, we're not directly perceiving the atom. We're perceiving an image of the atom given to us by the microscope or the measurement device. Okay. And so we're really just seeing this image of it. And so we're not directly perceiving it. So we can't claim that that thing exists, or we definitely cannot claim that it exists in the way that it appears to us by means of the measuring system or microscope. And so for Putnam now, or sorry, for von Frassen now, he's going to be skeptical about the existence of a lot more things than Putnam. He is unsure whether atoms exist in the way that we think they do. He's unsure whether, black holes exist in the way that we think they do, because these things we don't directly see or perceive with just our naked eyes. Okay. And now, von Frassen thinks that the way Putnam makes the distinction between observable versus theoretical is fallacious. It doesn't make sense. So he says the way that you just saw on the board prior, the way Putnam is making this distinction, he thinks seems like a trick. He's like, okay, the way Putnam is describing the distinction between observable versus theoretical, this strikes me as a trick, a change in the subject of discussion. Okay, so now why does von Frassen say this? Well, von Frassen thinks that, okay, when Putnam is making this distinction, really what he wants to distinguish between is things that can in principle be observed versus not. And the things that in principle can be observed are the things we can claim exist, and the things that we cannot in principle observe do not exist. So really the way Putnam makes the distinction is between physical stuff, because for anything that physically exists, in principle, we can observe that thing, versus non-physical stuff like angels, demons, ghosts that can never be perceived because they're non-physical. Now, von Frassen thinks that the way Putnam makes this distinction seems like a trick, okay? Because why? He says, shouldn't we define or distinguish between what is observable versus theoretical by means of what we can actually observe versus not? What we can actually observe with the naked eye versus not? Isn't that the way to distinguish between things that are directly observable versus things that are not, and therefore theoretical? And he's like, this is intuitive, right? It's like whether you can directly see it with the naked eye or not. If people cannot directly perceive black holes with the naked eye, if people cannot directly perceive electrons with the naked eye, we can't say that they exist. They're on the same status as ghosts and souls, even though we take it that atoms and black holes are physical entities, right? Even though they are physical entities, because we cannot directly observe them, they fall into the theoretical camp, according to von Frassen. So he says, yeah, shouldn't we define what is observable? Unlike Putnam, shouldn't we define what is observable, like me, von Frassen, by things that we can actually observe with the naked eye or not? Here's a quote from von Frassen. I'll put it in the chat to make this point. It's like an analogy. He says, I have a mortar and pestle made of copper and weighing about 1 kilo. Should I call it breakable because a giant can break it? Is the Empire, sorry, I should say Empire State Building. Is the Empire State Building in New York portable because a giant can move it? So what is he saying here? He's saying that, okay, if we went Putnam's route, and if we really distinguish between observable versus theoretical, as in principle observable versus not, then notice anything that's physical is observable. But now he says that's confusing because we cannot observe everything physical as human beings. I can't observe black holes. I can't observe, the microscopic or the quantum world. I can't directly observe those things. Either they're too small or they're too big or they're too far. And now when it comes to these things that we cannot directly observe, we can't just assume that they exist, right? We can't just take it that they exist just because maybe, in principle they're observable. It would be the same thing. It would be similar to saying that, as his analogy, a kilo of copper is breakable because a giant can break it. So no one would say, oh, a kilo of copper, that's breakable. That's easy to break. No one would say that. Wouldn't be a correct descriptor of the kilo of copper, because for any average human, it is not breakable, even if it's breakable to, I don't know, the average giant or superhuman. In the same way, it would make no sense to describe the Empire State Building as portable just because it's portable to a superhuman or a supergiant, because it's not portable. This giant building is not portable to everyday humans like me and you. So he says, yeah, once you kind of, notice this, what you'll notice is that, like, everyday objects that are observable to everyday humans, they get to be categorized as observable. And everyday objects that are non-observable to everyday humans, even if they physically exist, even if we might think that they physically exist, like atoms and quarks, strictly speaking, because we cannot directly observe them with the naked eye, we can't say that they're observable. That's how Van Frassen makes this distinction now. So in the same way, so here's really what he's asking in this quote. Here's another way of thinking about it. In the same way, is something observable in principle just because a superhuman with advanced technology can in principle observe it? That seems like a weird way to divide up the world, because in principle we can observe it. I mean, don't we really care about what we can actually observe versus not with our naked eye? Okay. So in other words, von Frassen is more what I call epistemically frugal than Putnam. And this just means that he's more skeptical of what we can say we know to exist. Now, for von Frassen, to accept a theory as true is simply to believe it's empirically adequate. The aspects of the scientific theory. So what does he mean by that? Let me be clear. So for von Frassen, to accept that a theory as true, to accept some scientific theory as true, it's simply believed that it is empirically adequate. And as the aspects of scientific theory that is observable by us is true, and the parts that we cannot directly observe we should not be committed to the truth of. So notice von Frassen is more of a skeptic. So he's like, when we have our scientific theories, let's say about, let's say we have a scientific theory about just the human body, to use an easy example. So let me actually put this in the chat first. I'm sorry. So we have a scientific theory about, I don't know, something with regards to the human body. I don't know how common it is to get heart disease based on your diet. Now, these things are directly observable. My heart, me, the things that I eat. And so when it comes to this theory about heart disease that we have, the part of the theory that we can say are true, we know that they are facts about the world, only concern the part of the theory that can be directly observed. And now the parts of the theory that discuss unobservable stuff, like bacteria, let's say, or viruses, or I don't know, even more small, like atoms, those parts of our theory of heart issues, those parts of our theory concerning, heart problems, those parts we cannot say are true. We can't say that the parts of the theory that talk about the microscopic world, whether it's bacteria, viruses, I mean, whatever theory, I just kind of made up theory of heart issues. Those parts of the theory we cannot say exist. And we cannot therefore say are true parts of the theory because we can never confirm the existence of bacteria, viruses, or atoms without the use of technological assistance. And so therefore we can never know for sure the way we observe the atoms under a microscope or, through Brownian motion actually corresponds to the exact features of an atom in reality. And so he is going to actually think now a lot of our scientific theories talk about things that we cannot claim is true. It talks about atoms. We can't claim that that stuff is true because we've never directly seen an atom, bacteria, virus, etc. And so any kind of more, von Frassen, if you take more of Putnam's view, if you are like, no, I think bacteria exist, I think viruses exist, I think atoms exist, he thinks really what you're doing here is you're not basing their existence on good evidence. You're not basing their existence on something you actually directly are observing. That's the only source of good evidence. Instead, you're basing your commitment to the existence of atoms based on a leap of faith. A leap of faith. So akin to like the religious person who takes a leap of faith in ascribing to the existence of God. This type of scientist is taking a leap of faith when they say atoms exist, because again, atoms cannot be directly observed. And von Frassen at least thinks that he thinks along the lines of our old friend Sir Francis Bacon, because now Sir Francis Bacon, remember, who's responsible for developing the scientific method, he was a skeptic too. So he was very skeptical about the truth of scientific theories, and he thought, you have to test and retest and retest, and really, you don't, strictly speaking, know if what parts are true, and if you can't directly observe that thing, it's unclear if it actually exists, because Sir Francis Bacon was very skeptical himself in the way he talked about science. Bos van Frassen thinks that he's in line with that traditional kind of point of view of being skeptical of things that cannot be directly observed. Okay. Now, I want you to take a minute and maybe pause the video because this is a helpful exercise. And if we're in class, I'd make you guys talk to the people next to you, and then we'd talk as a group. But since we're not in class together, I want you to maybe take a second, pause the video, and think of plausible objections or issues or critiques to plausible objections or critiques to Van Frossen's view and argument. Now, if you were trying to argue against Van Frossen, what might be some issues with the way he divides up, let's say, the observable versus theoretical? What are some issues with von Frossen's way of distinguishing observable versus theoretical? Why might you take issue with von Frossen's view? Why might you worry that this view, where because I'm observable, you can say that I exist, but that the atoms that make me up, because we cannot directly observe those, we can't say that those exist. What might be wrong with this view? Okay, so what might be some plausible objections? Take a moment to pause the video and maybe write down some issues that might confront you if you are Van Frossen and you have this view. So I'm giving you guys a moment to kind of pause and think of objections. Now, here are some objections. Now let me talk about some. So let me just write this in the chat first, and then I will talk about it. Okay, so here are some plausible objections to von Frossen's view. And now, notice for your writing assignment, I encourage you to come up with your own counter arguments either to Putnam or to von Frossen or both. But here are some that have been discussed in the literature, so I'm bringing them up now. So plausible worries or objections to von Frossen's distinction. Now, this distinction between observable, remember the observable, we can say these things exist. Yay! Like, this part of our scientific theory is true with a capital T. Whereas the theoretical, we can't say. So, I don't know. Exists. I cannot know. It's true. Okay. The way von Frossen distinguishes these two camps, and therefore the way he claims what exists versus does not exist, it depends on contingent features of our perceptual apparatus. So notice how it's kind of confusing. We know, given explicitly with the example of color, we know our perceptions are fallible. They're not always veridical, or like we don't really understand to what extent they are veridical. In other words, do I have the correct view of what colors are, or does the stomatopod, or does the dog? I mean, who knows, right? The point is that we can't take for granted that the way we perceive things is, in fact, the objective fact of reality. In other words, it's really science, right, that tells us what things are really like, independent of how we perceive them. It's science that told us that, objects only contain a surface reflectance distribution, and therefore the color green doesn't really exist in the abstract. It exists with regards to human perceivers. Now, once we notice that our direct perceptions of things are fallible, why would we use that as the measure or the marker of determining what exists versus doesn't? Again, I have my glasses off because now really think about it for me. I cannot really perceive many objects at all and what they look like without the help of this piece of technology. And so if I really divided up what exists versus does not exist by means of what I could directly observe, a lot of things that you would take exist, I can't say the same because I can't see that object. So if you see, a person in the distant, far distance, right? And you're like, oh, I see a person, that person exists. For someone who has such bad vision like me, I'm going to be like, what person? I just see a blob, right? What person exists? And so notice it starts to get really confusing. Like, so my commitment to what exists is different than yours just because I require this extra piece of technology to actually observe the world. That seems strange. And also, this is extra strange when we notice that the way we see the world and the way other organisms see the world is quite different. And it doesn't mean that one of us is right or wrong. It's just we evolved to see things that are important to us, evolutionarily. So we see, for instance, more colors than dogs because for us in our evolutionary history, it's very important So why are we trichromats and not dichromats? Us humans used to be dichromats. We used to see color in the same way dogs do. We'd only see browns and grays and things like that. Why did we evolve to see bright reds and greens? Because it was very important to us in our survival to be able to distinguish fruit that's edible from the green foliage. So, fruit is usually like red, pink, like those kind of colors, even yellow. Foliage is always green, more or less. And so we evolved to distinguish, yellows, pinks, purples, reds from green. So we can pick out fruit, in our evolutionary history. So we can kind of pick out fruit from green foliage to help us survive. Now that's notice this is totally contingent. We could have stayed the same as the dogs and been dichromatic if we didn't need to point out fruit against green foliage so much. But now, in virtue of this fact, in virtue that we really needed this skill, we evolved to have it. But that doesn't mean we have the more correct experience of color than the dog. And the same way, you can't say that the stomatopods, because they evolved to see ultraviolet colors, that the stomatopods have a more correct view of color than we do. Just because they can see more colors doesn't mean they're better or more correct than we are. It just means that they evolved to see things differently because it helps them with survival in ways that wouldn't help us. Okay? So doesn't this depend on contingent features of our perceptual apparatus? This distinction he's making with the naked human eye. It just depends on like how good your eyes are and how good the human eye is compared to other organisms. But that doesn't seem like the right method for determining what exists or does not exist, because again, our perceptions of things don't always track how things actually are. Science is better at telling us what things exist versus don't exist, because oftentimes science can help us go beyond our perceptual apparatus and go beyond that and really, understand what exists out there independently of how we tend to perceive that thing. So science is able to illustrate to us how our perceptions of things are different from how things really are in the world, and how things really are in the world, independent of our perceptions of those things. Are the non-observable qualities of the object. So again, von Frassen, for example, let's use a concrete example. Von Frassen would have to take this kind of strange position on color. Von Frassen would have to say that green, the color green exists, but now the surface reflectance distribution of the object that causes the color green does not exist, because the surface reflectance distribution cannot be directly observed, and so therefore we can't say it exists. But now notice how strange that is. The thing that is generated by means of the surface reflectance distribution, namely our experience of green, that exists, but the thing that caused it doesn't exist. It seems odd, right? Because first of all, what is green? I mean, not everyone is going to see this as green. If one of you were colorblind, you would not see this writing as green on the board. But now that doesn't mean that so what does that mean? I mean, I guess relative to you can't see green, so you don't know really what green is like. But now okay, green doesn't exist for the colorblind student. But then if green doesn't exist for the colorblind student, and if von Frassen is right, the surface reflectance distribution doesn't exist for the colorblind student because they can't directly perceive that, then what the heck is the colorblind student really perceiving? So again, it starts to just become super unclear. With color, at least, we want to say for the colorblind student, okay, yeah, green maybe doesn't exist because they can't see the color green. But definitely the surface reflectance distribution exists. They just can't, when they track that surface reflectance distribution, like the dog, they just see brownish, grayish, whatever. They don't see vivid colors like green, the colorblind student. That's really what we want to say. But now von Frosten would have to say for the colorblind student, both the color green does not exist because they don't perceive the color green, and the surface reflectance distribution of the object that brings about the color green, that also does not exist. And now it starts to get very puzzling. Well, then what is the colorblind student perceiving? We just don't know. That seems like a weird answer. So science is able to illustrate to us how our perceptions of things are distinct from how things are really in the world. That's what science tells us. It tells us our limits, our perceptual limits, and how us poor humans, like any other organism, we're limited by means of the way we perceive things. And therefore, we cannot take for granted that the way we perceive things actually track how things really are out there in reality. That's odd. In the same way, like me without my glasses, if really all that exists is contingent on the way I perceive things, then when me and you are walking and I don't have my glasses on, when you tell me that someone exists in the distance and I can't see them because I can't see well distance wise, I'm just going to say what? No, they don't exist. And now for me, the person doesn't exist, but for you, the person in the distance exists. Is that really what you're going to say, von Frosten? That's a strange thing. Either it's an objective fact that the person exists or does not, independent of how I perceive things versus how you perceive things without glasses. Okay. Um, so notice people, scientists like Putnam, they want to really distinguish between how things are in the world independent of how we perceive them. And once you are interested, or you kind of notice the importance of this as a scientist, you will find that von Frosten's view starts to become less and less clear, because now von Frosten thinks what's important not is what exists independently of how you perceive things. What von Frosten thinks is important is what exists. So what von Frosten instead thinks is that what exists is entirely reliant on how you perceive the thing. So what exists is what you perceive to exist. And so things that you cannot directly perceive, we cannot claim exist. And most scientists tend to disagree. They tend to think that science tells us what exists independent of how humans perceive things. Okay, like science tells us that a surface reflectance distributions exist, or atoms exist, or whatever exists, independent of how we perceive those actual things. Whereas, we just perceive things based on random features about ourselves, what organism we are, whether we have good vision or not, or whether we need glasses, whether we are born with blindness or not. These are just random contingent things. So again, here's an even more stark example. Just because my friend Karen is blind doesn't mean that the visual properties of objects don't exist at all. She knows that she's missing this sense of visual perception. So she understands that there's something out there in the universe. There's a way to perceive things that she can't get at. That's what it means to be blind. And so, Karen and I can agree that there are properties of objects out there independent of us, independent of how my perceptual system works and versus hers. We know that there are, properties of light that can be detected by the human eye, even if she doesn't have the proper human eye to detect them. We can both agree on that. And von Frosten, he seems to claim, he makes the opposite claim. He would claim that my blind friend, what really exists for her are going to be things independent of vision. And that is going to be a different set of facts that in comparison to me. So what I take to exist versus what she takes to exist, that's going to be different given that she can't see and I can. And now how weird is that? So what exists for her is different than what exists for me. I mean, existence isn't about just how well you can perceive things. Existence is like, okay, does that thing exist? independently of how I perceive that thing. And if you have the intuition that for both me and Karen, the person who's blind, for both us, the same objects exist. It's just that we are tracking different features of the objects based on having vision or not. If you tend to take that view, you are in agreement with Putnam. If you instead agree that yes, light properties of objects do not exist for Karen, but they do exist for me, and therefore we have a different set of objects in the universe that exist for us dependent on our perceptual apparatus, then you agree more with von Frassen. Okay? Now, for your assignment, I want you guys to discuss the observational theoretical debate, discuss Putnam's view, include quotes from the book, discuss von Frassen's view, include quotes from the book, and then argue which view, von Frassen or Putnam's, do you find more tenable and why. And I will give very detailed comments so you guys have nice feedback on your writing assignments. And so you can make good sense of this debate. Okay, everyone, thank you. Have a good day.